Last night was the first night I spent in the new apartment. I was really nervous to be there, as I talked about yesterday. And it turns out he was also a little bit anxious about me being there because he was worried about making the space comfortable enough for me so that I would feel at ease and start to feel more like it was our space and not just his space. He understands why it's hard for me to be in that space right now, and I thought it was really kind of him to give me an out from staying the night in case it was just too much. I came prepared to stay the night. I packed my overnight bag and had the plan in place, but he said if it was too much, I could just leave at any time. So we sat on the couch and we talked for a while, and the more we talked, the more I opened up to the space and the more comfortable I got in the space. It still does not feel like anything related to me. It still feels like the space that he got for him, but I really appreciate the effort he's putting into trying to make it more of an our space. I'm working on shifting my mindset, and he's being really nice and gracious about that, which I appreciate. So we did a lot of talking last night, and then we cooked dinner together, and he had asked me to bring my big binder with me. And I was really kind of excited about that. Apparently he'd already started working through parts of his binder and he saw some things that we could work on together, so he asked me to bring it. And that was great because when I was putting the binders together, I really only intended to make the one for me. But as I was assembling it and putting the tabs together, I recognized that the things I wanted to work on, that these activities and these handouts would also be helpful to him and helpful to us to do together. So I made a binder for him too, having no idea if he would use it. And when I presented it to him, he flipped through it and he thought it was great and thanked me for it. So it feels really good that he sees value in that, and it felt really good that he had picked out some things he wanted us to work on together last night in that space. Felt really, really great. So we did that, and I'll turn to that exercise in just a minute because wow, do I have some feelings about that. But the more we talked, the heavier things got. And the heavier things got, the more intense the emotionality was. And I don't think either one of us intended on it to be that heavy last night. I don't think either one of us intended to go just that deep into where we went. But that's kind of a thing that we've always done. When we get started talking about things, we just talk and talk and talk and explore and think through things. And really, we've always just enjoyed that conversational aspect of our relationship. So right now, we're struggling to know when to stop that, when to put a pause on that. Where is the boundary of, we have talked about this enough in this moment and we need to let it go. So that's definitely something that we're going to be thinking through. Ultimately, I did end up staying the night. It's actually really sweet because he bought bedding that he knew that I would like. He was very proud of picking out bedding that he thought I would like. And he was right. Exactly something I would have picked out if I was buying new bedding. So it was great. It was a good experience overall. Woke up this morning and started the day, and we both had a lot to get done today, a lot to get through the day, so we didn't have a lot of time together this morning before I left. But overall, it went really, really, really well. My anxiety was right about up to here. I did rely on the medication as I needed to, which brought it down to a very manageable level for the things that we were talking through and doing last night. So that was great. But the exercise that he picked was a trigger exercise. And usually when you think about triggers, you think about them being like persons, place, situations, things that contribute to some kind of unwanted response or a behavior or something. You think about triggers, most often we talk about it in terms of addiction. And this triggers worksheet actually came from an addiction worksheet series, which we're applying in a lot of different ways. Addictions can be a lot of different things. Most of us, when we think about addictions, we think about drugs and alcohol because that's kind of the go-to. That's the thing we've all been primed to think of. But in my case, I was modifying this worksheet to use it for behavioral addictions. So when I think about that, I'm going to expand my definition of addiction to be what the American Society of Addiction Medicine calls an addiction, which is a treatable chronic disease involving complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experiences. People with addiction use substances or engage in behaviors that become compulsive and often continue despite harmful consequences. So, pretty great definition, I think, because it matches up with what I was taught clinically about the neurobiology of addiction mechanisms. Addiction doesn't happen from having a lack of willpower or a result of bad decision making. Your brain chemistry actually changes over time from addiction. And in short, the way that works is when something pleasurable happens, an activity, or maybe it's a substance, a behavior, your brain, when it recognizes it as pleasurable, there's this release of dopamine. And our brains are wired to increase the odds that we are going to engage in pleasurable activities. So whenever dopamine is released, there's a signal that this is important and that our brain needs to remember this and hold on to this and repeat this activity and look for options to repeat this activity. So it's this neural connectivity that makes it easier to do the thing over and over and over and over, which leads to the formation of bad habits. It can also lead, of course, to the formation of good habits. So, dopamine being the reward system, that neurotransmitter is really important. The things we do over and over because we like them, it's because dopamine is at play there. And the things we do over and over, even if we don't like them, compulsive behaviors like the binge eating part that I do, again, dopamine is a part of that. When I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about the behavioral manifestations of addictions. For me, it's eating, it's binge eating. But for other people, that could be, gambling, it could be exercise, it could be dieting, it could be shopping, it could be sex, pornography, video gaming, excessive internet use, engaging in risky behaviors, like shoplifting or risky hookups or thrill-seeking behaviors and adrenaline junkies. Lots of ways that behaviors can escalate to an addictive level. And so that's what I was dealing with this worksheet. And it breaks it down into trigger categories: emotional state, people, places, things, thoughts, and activities or situations. And I had to identify in each of these 6 trigger categories very specific things. So like emotional states, I have anger, fear, shame, feeling aggrieved, being jealous, feeling sad. I had to identify some people. It was really interesting to both of us that I identified him as one of my trigger categories for eating. I had to look at places, which could be, my own kitchen, the pantry that I have overstocked with all of my favorite foods, or Mexican restaurants, because I am all about the tacos. Love, love, love the tacos. Things that could be trigger points, like for me, it's the scale. For me, it's seeing certain foods, like seeing the tacos or seeing the cakes, seeing the junk food. I really like potato chips. I also had to look at thoughts like self-hatred and envy and fear and guilt and shame and thoughts of failure. And I had to look at activities and situations like eating out and gatherings, or when I'm sitting in the house by myself feeling all of those other things, and that situation of the loneliness plus the feelings can be a trigger point for me. Identifying the categories was really interesting. That was kind of the first step. And so I had to look at my 3 biggest triggers in detail, and I'm not going to bore you with what those are. And then I had to look at strategies for avoiding or reducing the exposure, and then I had to describe strategies for dealing with it head on when I can't avoid it. The thing that struck me the most about this is I am intentionally creating situations over and over and over and over that are the trigger points. I am willfully putting myself in a lot of these situations and a lot of these positions. And yes, I recognize that it is part of the reward system, the way my brain has been rewired. I get that. I accept that. But I also know that a lot of times it's not about that. A lot of times it has just become so habitual for me. So when I think about even going out to lunch today with my best friend, I know on here a trigger point on the sheet of paper is going to Mexican restaurants. We met for lunch today and she said, you choose the place And I chose this really shitty Mexican restaurant that we both like because it's got queso that reminds her of her childhood, and I like it because I get to see the pleasure on her face when she's eating the queso that reminds her of her childhood. But I chose a restaurant that's a trigger point for me, and I shared that with her. We talked about it at the restaurant, and she had this look of horror on her face that I had chosen this, and that I put myself in this position. She said, let's just leave right now. And I took this as a test. If I could manage this meal, if I could manage these triggers, if I could face it head on, if I could do the things, the strategies that I described in here for when I have to face it head on, maybe there's hope for this. So I employed the strategies that I had listed. Not really successful. Still ate way more than I meant to of the chips and the queso. I did have the healthier salad, but all in all, it still was not what I was needing it to be. And once again, I entered into that overeating state. It didn't hit the binge eating state, but it was definitely the overeating state and a trigger point. And then I spent the rest of the afternoon struggling to not binge because I felt bad about that. Okay. So fast forward to my thinking later in the day, and as this day has progressed, I've thought about, what if I took these trigger categories, the emotional state, the people, the places, the things, the thoughts, and the activities and situations, and I applied that to something other than addiction, like repeated problematic interactions in my relationship. An example that comes to mind, if you've ever had a corporate job, worked in kind of a corporate office, there's like maybe sales meetings or team meetings, and people gather at a conference room, and maybe it's like every Monday morning at 9 o'clock. So every Monday morning at 9 o'clock, you go in this space, this room, this situation, and you start to get this sense of dread. And it becomes habituated because it happens every week, and you get that same feeling every week. And then on a random Wednesday afternoon at 2:30 in the afternoon, they say to meet in that same room, and it's celebrating somebody's birthday. But when you walk in there, even when you see balloons and cake, your body still has this feeling tied to the habituated meetings you've had where there's this negative connotation, that trigger point. And even though it's something a little bit different, it's still a trigger point. But think about just those meetings, those weekly meetings in that room, those awful, awful meetings that we all know could have just been emails. I do the same thing at home. We would sit on the couch, opposite ends of a couch. We would watch a TV show, eating dinner on the couch, I know, not great, but watching TV and not talking. And this would go on for 3 or 4 episodes of something. And then at the end of the night, we would look at each other and be really, really, really irritated that we had not had any communication, we hadn't had any contact, we hadn't had any sense of intimacy with one another, even though we're the only 2 people in the space. Night after night after night. The people, the 2 of us, the emotional state became anger and frustration and just sadness. The place, our own home, the couch in our home, what was supposed to be our safest space, the space we set up to be our sanctuary from the world, was no longer our safe space. The things around us, the food, the TV, the couch, the thoughts we were having, just the dread of even being there, and then just the activity, just sitting there, zoning out in front of a television, sharing space, talking about nothing, and then getting just fucking frustrated and pissed that we're no longer connected. I'm not going to go so far as to say that I think I or we got addicted to that disconnect, because that would just be a leap that I don't think the science supports. But I do think it makes me think a lot more about trigger points or activation points and how we fall into this routine and we do these things over and over and over and over and then wonder why nothing is ever any better. And I'm looking at that now. The thing I'm facing right now as I'm actually verbalizing this is now I'm thinking about all of the other ways in my life that I have done that I have triggered myself to the point of either failure or procrastination or some level of emotional paralysis. So this exercise was really hard for me because even though it was specifically designed to be about triggering addictive behaviors, I'm now taking it into other areas and recognizing the same pattern that triggers these behaviors has triggered other unhealthy behaviors, even if they're not addictive. And one of the things that we're talking about now is that we have to break those trigger points, or this relationship is never going to be any different. And that's a lot to figure out with what we're both going through. So having a not great reaction to this exercise, in part because I'm facing realities I didn't want to face, and just because it's hella hard work, but also because it means more than I was recognizing that it means. So that's where I'm at in day one today. See how the rest of the day goes, and I will check in with you tomorrow.